First up though, India's External Affairs Minister Sushma Swaraj has said that there is no encirclement of India by China and that India is fully equipped to defend itself. Responding to the opposition's questions in Rajya Sabha on Thursday, Ms. Swaraj defended the government and said that every country is with India on the border standoff with China. She also said that if China unilaterally tries to change the status quo on Doka, then there is a threat to India's security.
भारत और चीन की सीमा अभी तय होनी है। चीन और भूटान की सीमा भी अभी तय होनी है। दोनों के अपने अपने मैकेनिज्म्स हैं। हमारे यहाँ स्पेशल रिप्रेजेंटेटिव का प्रोविजन है। पहले श्री शिवशंकर मेनन और अब आज के NSA अजीत डोवल हमारी ओर से स्पेशल रिप्रेजेंटेटिव हैं। और भूटान का अपना है, वहाँ K4 स्वयं ये एक मैकेनिज्म को चला रहे हैं। ये दोनों सार्वभौमिक देश हैं। भारत और चीन अपनी सीमा तय कर लेंगे, भूटान और चीन अपनी सीमा तय करेंगे। लेकिन एक जगह ऐसी है जिसे ट्राई जंक्शन पॉइंट कहते हैं और उस ट्राई जंक्शन पॉइंट में ये सहमति है, रिटर्न में सहमति है। 2012 में एक समझौता हुआ था भारत और चीन के बीच में। उसके पैराग्राफ 13 में लिखा हुआ है कि ट्राई जंक्शन पॉइंट पर भारत, चीन और थर्ड कंट्रीज, वो थर्ड कंट्री का मतलब भूटान, मिलकर तय करेंगे। अब जो चीन आया, चीन बीच बीच में बहुत बार आता रहा, सड़कें भी बनाता रहा, कभी कच्ची, कभी पक्की, कभी थोड़ी पक्की, कभी वो सड़क टूट गई, वो चीज़ें उनकी चलती रहीं, वो गतिविधियाँ उनकी लगातार जारी थी। इस बार वो बुलडोज़र, एक्सकेवेटर्स ये लेकर के आए और उनकी नीयत इस बार ये है कि वो ट्राई जंक्शन तक पहुँच जाएँ, एक ऐसी जगह तक पहुँच जाए, क्योंकि बटांगला उसमें मेन जगह है जहाँ से वो ट्राई जंक्शन पहुँच जाता, कि वो वहाँ नीचे आ जाएं, जिससे यूनिलैटरली स्टेटस को उस ट्राई जंक्शन पॉइंट का ख़त्म हो जाए। तो हम जो इस भूमिका में आए वो इसलिए आए, जब तक चीन और भूटान की सीमा चल रही थी हमें कुछ नहीं था। हमारी अपनी सीमा विवाद चल रहा है, उसका हम लोग अपने आप हल कर रहे हैं। लेकिन ट्राई जंक्शन पॉइंट आते ही हमारा हित आ गया। अगर चीन यूनिलैटरली उस ट्राई जंक्शन पॉइंट के स्टेटस को बदल देता है तो सीधे सीधे फिर हमारी सुरक्षा को चुनौती होती है। तो कारण ये है। जो आपका कहना कि मांग क्या है, मांग उनकी ये कि हम अपनी सेनाएं वहां से विड्रॉ। आप कहते हैं कि हम क्या चाहते हैं, हम ये चाहते हैं कि अगर संवाद चल रहा है कि भाई अगर कोई बातचीत बैठकर करनी है तो दोनों अपनी अपनी सेनाएं हटाएं। तो कोई भी अनरीजनेबल बात भारत की तरफ से नहीं हो रही है। सारे देश हमारे साथ हैं, क्योंकि सब देशों को ये लगता है भूटान जैसे छोटे देश में वो आक्रामक हो रहा है, क्योंकि भूटान ने प्रोटेस्ट किया, उनसे 4 दिन बाद ही प्रोटेस्ट किया, रिटर्न में प्रोटेस्ट किया उनके एम्बेसडर ने कि आप ये क्या कर रहे हैं। उसके बाद भूटानी गवर्नमेंट ने इसको प्रोटेस्ट को कहा। तो इसीलिए सारे के सारे देश ये समझ रहे हैं कि भारत ने जो अपना मत रखा है और जो पक्ष रखा है वो गलत नहीं है, न्याय हमारे पक्ष के साथ है, इसको सारे देश मान रहे हैं।
थैंक यू। All right, to talk more about Ms. Swaraj's comments, I'm joined in the studio by senior journalist Arun Anand. Also on the broadcast with us via the phone line is strategic affairs expert Brahma Chilani. Mr. Chilani, if I can come to you first. First of all, thanks for speaking with us here at WION. Do you think India's response and comments on the standoff so far have been adequate?
They had not been adequate. In fact, India had failed to respond appropriately to the daily barrage of Chinese official and state media rhetoric. But I'm glad that Foreign Minister Sushma Swaraj finally spoke up. She made an excellent statement in Parliament today. I wish that statement had been made earlier. But we should bear in mind the main point that Ms. Swaraj made. As far as the border situation is concerned, there is no new threat that India faces today. What India faces is a psychological war that China is waging. It's waging the psychological war, including by exploiting India's political divisions and by feeding the Indian media daily war rhetoric. So we have to be careful that we should not really get too taken in by China's psychological war.
But sir, what's changed within China that's prompted it to wage this psychological war, so to speak? Has there been any event, you think, or an event that's coming up that perhaps has prompted this sort of belligerence?
Well, the reason why they're waging psychological war is that they're trying to portray themselves as the victim and India as the aggressor. And they are trying to obscure the main issue, the fact that China encroached on the territory of tiny Bhutan. That is the issue that caused the standoff. But you will not see any mention of Bhutan in Chinese official statements or even in the Chinese state media rhetoric against India. It's deliberate. The whole idea is to obscure that aggression against Bhutan and pin the blame on India. And the entire psychological warfare that is being waged is designed to tame India without firing a shot. They believe that by building psychological pressure on India, they can make India withdraw its troops from Doklam Plateau and thereby have their way.
All right, stay with me, sir. Arun, just going by what Mr. Chelani just said, he said that China is portraying itself as the victim, India as the aggressor. Do you think India's ascension as an influential partner, a power center, has something to do with the way China is behaving right now?
Yeah, I think one that I fully agree with Mr. Chelani on two things. One is that the Indian media has to be very careful that we don't become a tool in the hands of basically the Chinese propaganda arms. And second is that it's more of a psychological warfare which they are conducting. And as I mentioned earlier, that it's partly basically that China has been trying to emerge as a superpower, and they are simultaneously also playing the game of basically projecting themselves as the victim. And one also has to understand that they are not very comfortable with the way India's proximity has been growing with US and the other powers, basically European powers. So I would say basically that I think it's more of a game of positioning. Basically, it's kind of who is going to blink first. So in that regard, I think the statement made by the External Affairs Minister was quite a balanced this thing, because you can't afford to be jingoistic also.
All right, which the People's Daily and other platforms for the Chinese have been. There's been a great degree of jingoism on display. I suppose we'll have to take a cue from that and abstain in terms of our media coverage. I'm also joined on the phone line by Dr. Sriram Cholia. He is the Professor and Dean at Jindal School of International Affairs. Mr. Cholia, thanks very much for speaking with us here on the broadcast. If I can ask you, where does Bhutan stand in all of this? India has always demonstrated, a great degree of, let's say, support for all of its allies. But has Bhutan sort of become a pawn in some ways between the standoff, in the standoff between the two Asian giants?
I don't think so. I think Bhutan is relying heavily on India to be able to counterbalance much mightier and heavier player, which is China. The Bhutanese have a dispute with the Chinese over Doklam, where we have been assisting the Bhutanese to prevent the Chinese from building motorable roads that can ultimately lead to mini invasion and deprivation of Bhutan's sovereign rights. So Bhutan is interested in actually negotiated settlement with the Chinese on these issues, but the Chinese are preempting them by using blackmail strategy through building these roads. And I think we have come to the assistance of a smaller player. And of course, our own national security is at stake. But at the same time, our credibility as an ally. Remember, Bhutan has no diplomatic relations with China. It's heavily reliant on India for its national security. So I think India's credibility as a net provider of security is at stake with Bhutan. And I think we are lending a hand to a very, very needy and weak country. So in that context, the Chinese have been trying to raise the issue of Indian hegemony over Bhutan. But if you actually look at it carefully, on the issue of Doklam, they are heavily outnumbered and outmaneuvered by China in the past. And it's the first time that finally they have gotten some spine because of India's proactive measures. So I think we should be proud of the fact that India has actually come to the rescue of what was going to be a losing cause for Bhutan.
Right, stay with me, Dr. Cholia. I just want to take one more question across to Mr. Chelani. Mr. Chelani, do you feel that India is finding itself sort of compelled in many ways to assert or to show that it is in full support for smaller nations like Bhutan in order to prevent China from spreading its influence in what is India's backyard?
India has no choice. India is obligated by its defense arrangements with Bhutan to come to the aid of Bhutan when Bhutan's national security is threatened. So India is doing what the arrangements require it to do. This is not a geopolitical gameplay. India is the security guarantor of Bhutan. And when China encroached on the Doka plateau of Bhutan, it also has a direct bearing on India's long-term national security, as the External Affairs Minister told Parliament this morning. So India had to intervene. But I think what India needs to do is to respond to China's psychological war. Unfortunately, in India, we're not discussing what India ought to do. We are only spending time analyzing China's intentions, for example. But we need to really focus on what India needs to do. How should India respond? And I think India should play psychological hardball with China. It appears too zealous at the moment in wanting talks with China. I think instead of appearing too eager for talks with China, India should insist that China first withdraw its troops from the Doka plateau and drop its demands that it has made. And I think the External Affairs Minister this morning went almost to that extent when she said if China wants India to withdraw troops from the Doka plateau, it also ought to withdraw troops from that plateau. So this is the first statement by any Indian official which really responds to China's psychological warfare.
Do you think, Mr. Chelani, that the current government has the capability or has displayed the intention of the willingness to play hardball with China? I'm referring in terms of the surgical strike last year and taking or tackling Pakistan head-on in terms of terror. Do you think the same can be expected from the government when it comes to China?
The answer is yes and no, because it's in two parts. One, India very swiftly intervened militarily to stop the PLA construction of a road through Bhutan's Doklam Plateau. This came as a shock to China because it did not anticipate India's swift military intervention. So this shows that India is willing to go the whole hog when it comes to the defense of its national security and to the defense of an ally like Bhutan. On the other hand, India has shown itself to be ill-prepared to counter China's psychological warfare. For example, this standoff was made public 4 weeks ago by Beijing. Officially, we have made only two statements. The second statement was made this morning by External Affairs Minister Sushma Swaraj. In comparison, the Chinese have issued more than 36 statements. On a daily basis, they are issuing statements attacking India, fulminating against India, and using the state media to wage psychological warfare. And we are unprepared to counter this kind of sustained psychological operations by China.
All right, stay with me, Mr. Chelani, Dr. Cholia, and of course, Arun. I just want to take our viewers through what the External Affairs Minister actually said in Rajya Sabha today. Let's listen to Ms. Swaraj's comments on the India-China Doklam standoff.
भारत और चीन की सीमा अभी तय होनी है. चीन और भूटान की सीमा भी अभी तय होनी है. दोनों के अपने अपने मैकेनिज्म्स हैं. हमारे यहाँ स्पेशल रिप्रेजेंटेटिव का प्रोविज़न है. पहले श्री शिवशंकर मेनन और अब आज के NSA अजीत डोवल हमारी ओर से स्पेशल रिप्रेजेंटेटिव हैं. और भूटान का अपना है, वहाँ K4 स्वयं ये एक मैकेनिज्म को चला रहे हैं. ये दोनों सार्वभौमिक देश हैं. भारत और चीन अपनी सीमा तय कर लेंगे, भूटान और चीन अपनी सीमा तय करेंगे. लेकिन एक जगह ऐसी है जिसे ट्राई जंक्शन पॉइंट कहते हैं, और उस ट्राई जंक्शन पॉइंट में ये सहमति है, रिटर्न में सहमति है. 2012 में एक समझौता हुआ था भारत और चीन के बीच में. उसके पैराग्राफ 13 में लिखा हुआ है कि ट्राई जंक्शन पॉइंट पर भारत, चीन और थर्ड कंट्रीज, वो थर्ड कंट्री का मतलब भूटान, मिलकर तय करेंगे. अब जो चीन आया, चीन बीच बीच में बहुत बार आता रहा, सड़कें भी बनाता रहा, कभी कच्ची, कभी पक्की, कभी थोड़ी पक्की, कभी वो सड़क टूट गई. वो चीज़ें उनकी चलती रहीं, वो गतिविधियाँ उनकी लगातार जारी थी. इस बार वो बुलडोज़र, एक्सकेवेटर्स ये लेकर के आए, और उनकी नीयत इस बार ये है कि वो ट्राई जंक्शन तक पहुंच जाएं, एक ऐसी जगह तक पहुंच जाए, क्योंकि बटांगला उसमें मेन जगह है जहां से वो ट्राई जंक्शन पहुंच जाता, कि वो वहां नीचे आ जाएं, जिससे यूनिलैटरली स्टेटस को उस ट्राई जंक्शन पॉइंट का खत्म हो जाए। तो हम जो इस भूमिका में आए वो इसलिए आए, जब तक चीन और भूटान की सीमा चल रही थी हमें कुछ नहीं था, हमारी अपनी सीमा विवाद चल रहा है, उसका हम लोग अपने आप हल कर रहे हैं, लेकिन ट्राई जंक्शन पॉइंट आते ही हमारा हित आ गया। अगर चीन यूनिलैटरली उस ट्राई जंक्शन पॉइंट के स्टेटस को बदल देता है तो सीधे सीधे फिर हमारी सुरक्षा को चुनौती होती है। तो कारण ये है, जो आपका कहना कि मांग क्या है, मांग उनकी ये कि हम अपनी सेनाएं वहां से विड्रॉ, आप कहते हैं कि हम क्या चाहते हैं, हम ये चाहते हैं कि अगर संवाद चल रहा है कि भाई अगर कोई बातचीत बैठकर करनी है तो दोनों अपनी अपनी सेनाएं हटाएं, तो कोई भी अनरीजनेबल बात भारत की तरफ से नहीं हो रही है। सारे देश हमारे साथ हैं, क्योंकि सब देशों को ये लगता है भूटान जैसे छोटे देश में वो आक्रामक हो रहा है, क्योंकि भूटान ने प्रोटेस्ट किया, उनसे 4 दिन बाद ही प्रोटेस्ट किया, रिटर्न में प्रोटेस्ट किया उनके एम्बेसडर ने कि आप ये क्या कर रहे हैं, उसके बाद भूटानी गवर्नमेंट ने इसको प्रोटेस्ट को कहा। तो इसीलिए सारे के सारे देश ये समझ रहे हैं कि भारत ने जो अपना मत रखा है और जो पक्ष रखा है वो गलत नहीं है, न्याय हमारे पक्ष के साथ है, इसको सारे देश मान रहे हैं। थैंक यू। भारत और चीन की सीमा अभी
All right, a strong statement, no doubt, by the External Affairs Minister Sushma Swaraj. But Dr. Cholia, if I can come to you, has this statement come too late? Has India lost precious time in responding to what Mr. Chelani has called China's psychological warfare?
Well, I think the parliament session has just begun, so the timing is explained by that. But I think it is important that the government reach a consensus with the opposition parties and brief them before making this statement, so that there's complete national unanimity on this subject. I think it's also important that Sushma Swaraj has made the point that we can defend ourselves, especially at this location, which is currently under the radar, the tri-junction. We have relatively better capabilities to defend our positions. So I think the Chinese are resorting to this psychological warfare and threats and media hostility. One of their diplomats has said there are only 3 options for the Indians: either they vacate, as in like withdraw Doklam, or be captured or get killed. You know, this kind of like real red meat kind of emotional outbursts from China are somewhat uncharacteristic, and it shows that they are rattled because they had not expected that India would come to the rescue of Bhutan and also defend its national interests so proactively. So I think there is an issue with the overall LAC preparedness. We are vulnerable in different sectors, and I anticipate that the Chinese may try their usual trick, which is to do incursions in Ladakh or towards Arunachal side. I mean, those are always the threats, and we need to be prepared for them. So if Sushma Swaraj is coming on Parliament and saying that we are capable of defending ourselves and that we don't take the threats too seriously, I think we need to put our money and our investments and our forces where our words are, and by which I mean we need to really strengthen our defensive capabilities all across the 4,057-kilometer long line of actual control, because until we do that, we will not be able to sustain this position for too long in Doklam.
Fair enough. Arun, do you think that, the statement, of course, has been a strong statement, a well thought out, a well put forth statement by the External Affairs Minister. But the government has had opportunity before to clarify its stance on what's going on. Do you think that the response, at least in terms of timing, has been wanting?
No, I wouldn't say that the response has been wanting. I think the way China is as Mr. Chelani was also saying, every country has its own way of handling the affairs. And the external affairs policy of China has largely been basically, it's an authoritarian state, we all know, and it largely remains in a very, very aggressive mode. So it's very natural that there can be dozens of statements from them. But in India, you have to take, being a democratic country, the government also had to take into confidence the opposition. So they did that also, and they've tried to maintain basically a very kind of a balanced response. So I wouldn't say this thing. I would say that we can't follow the same template which China has been following. We need to have a different template, and we have followed this template quite successfully. And apart from that, on ground action has not been wanting so far. That is what is important,
right,
rather than making too many statements about it.
So but in terms of cohesion, the coming together of all the parties when it comes to India's position, do you think that the government has been able to convince the opposition about where the situation stands, and that the opposition is going to rally with the government when it comes? Of course, this is national security and nationalism that we're talking about. Do you think that's been achieved?
Yeah, I think one good thing about the Indian polity has been that whatever the acrimony may be between the political parties over different issues, but largely on the issues of foreign policy and national security, largely there has been a consensus. And in this case also, largely at least, there seems to be a consensus.
But even that wasn't the case with the surgical strikes.
Yeah, that wasn't. I said, that's why I didn't say absolutely. I said largely there has been consensus, and I would look at it like more of an aberration, because it was not. It did not continue for too long, because those who were kind of trying to rake up the issue realize that it's basically kind of a boomeranging. So I would say that largely the government has been able to, and I would give due credit to the opposition also for being basically backing the government on this crucial issue. So I think a lot of credit goes to the, a lot of maturity has been shown by the people in opposition also.
Okay, and last time around, of course, there was the difference between the fact that there were some very important state elections coming up as well at the time of the surgical strike. So there was a different conversation, I suppose. Like you said, we can't compare templates. We should have different ones that looking at this. But Dr. Chaulia, if I can ask you that, going by Ms. Swaraj's comments in Parliament today, how do you perceive this playing out in the next couple of days, weeks, months? What are we looking at? How exactly is the standoff going to resolve itself, or is the world community going to have to step in? What's going to happen next, in your opinion?
I think our call for China to roll back its unilateral intervention in Doka will prevail, because the Chinese, of course, have raised the tempo and the stakes by challenging and even threatening full-scale war all along the LAC. But if you study their current economic condition, as well as their overall relationship with the United States and with the rest of the world, they cannot risk this full-scale conflict that they are crowing about in the media. So we must take some of these threats with a pinch of salt. But as I said, our self-defense preparedness is the key. If we can be alert, really, all along the western, central, and the eastern sectors, northern, central, and eastern sectors of the LAC, I think we will be able to achieve our goal, which is to prevent the building of these advanced motorable roads all the way up to the Tri-Junction. And of course, we will withdraw if they stop, if they roll back their blueprints of coming all the way up to the Tri-Junction. So I think we will also withdraw, and so will they. If you look back at earlier such standoffs like Sumdurong-Chu 1987, even Daulat Beg Oldie, which happened 2013, these are the classic cases of China-India conflict on the border, which have ultimately resulted in no clashes and no deaths per se. Yes. So the last time we actually had active conflict was 1967. When we lost forces, and so did the Chinese. So I think better sense will prevail eventually. But right now, China is hurt. It's a hegemon that is hurt and is showing its peak, because it had not expected that a relatively smaller power like India would challenge it so openly and be defiantly opposed to it. They are not going to have their way like they do with Philippines or Vietnam, which are much, much smaller in the South China Sea. With India, I think they've come to realize that they cannot dictate and hector us like they used to do in the past. Absolutely. And I think that's a big lesson for the Chinese from this whole episode.
Okay, we leave it at that. Dr. Chaulia, thanks very much for joining us on the broadcast. Arun Anand and of course Mr. Chelani for speaking with us here on that contentious topic, if you will, at WION. We'll talk more when we come back after this short break. Do stay tuned.